Good evening, everyone. I am Jane Pauley, and you are listening to Healthy Kidneys After 60, where we share stories that do more than just inform. They protect the life you have worked so hard to build. Tonight, we are touching on a subject that feels like a shadow for many of us as we age, the sudden, silent threat of a stroke. But we are not here to talk about fear. We are here to talk about power, the power of knowing exactly what to do when every second counts. To help us navigate this, I am deeply honored to welcome a man who has spent decades at the front lines of medical journalism and neurosurgery, someone whose voice has guided millions through health crises with both expertise and empathy, Dr. Sanjay Gupta.
Thank you, Jane. It is a privilege to be here. In all my years in the ER and reporting from around the globe, I have realized that the most critical moments do not always happen in a hospital. They happen in living rooms, in gardens, and in kitchens. I am looking forward to sharing how a little bit of calm and the right reflex can truly change the course of a life.
Dr. Gupta, I want to start with a scene that I think many of our listeners can visualize all too clearly, perhaps because it is their own kitchen or their own quiet afternoon. Imagine a man standing alone. He is just reaching for a glass of water, or maybe he is about to start dinner, and suddenly something is not right. His arm feels heavy, like it belongs to someone else. He tries to say something to the empty room, but the words feel like they are catching on his teeth. In that frozen moment, the most natural instinct in the world is to panic, to stand up quickly, or to pace around the room trying to shake it off, hoping that if he just moves enough, the feeling will come back. We often think of a stroke as a lightning bolt, something that strikes and it is over. But is that really the case, Sanjay? Is there actually a window, a brief period of time where the story hasn't been fully written yet? And is it true that the brain is essentially waiting for us to make a move?
Jane, you have painted a picture that is the reality for hundreds of thousands of people every year, and you hit on something profound, the window. In the medical world, we have a saying that I want everyone listening to internalize: time is brain. It sounds clinical, but it is deeply personal. When a stroke begins, it is often not an instantaneous lights out for the entire affected area. Instead, there is a core of the brain that is immediately struggling because its blood supply is cut off, but surrounding that core is a region we call the penumbra. And think of the penumbra as a zone of cells that are stunned or hibernating. They are not dead yet, but they are gasping for air. They are waiting. Every single minute that passes without intervention, about 1.9 million neurons can die. That sounds like a terrifying number, and it is, but it also means that every minute we can save by staying calm and acting correctly is a minute where we are literally preserving who that person is, their ability to speak, to walk, to remember their grandchildren's names. This is where knowledge truly defeats fear.
It is incredible to think that the brain is fighting that hard to stay with us, even when the body feels like it is failing. But when you say time is brain, it puts so much pressure on that person standing in the kitchen. If they are alone and they feel that numbness or that sudden confusion, their heart starts racing. They might try to catch their breath, or they might try to lie flat on the floor, or even try to drive themselves to the hospital because they don't want to wait for an ambulance. I have talked to so many seniors who say their biggest fear is being helpless in those minutes. You mentioned that there is something we can do immediately, even before the paramedics arrive, to protect that hibernating part of the brain. Before we get into the physical steps, can you help us understand the goal? Are we trying to restart the blood flow ourselves? Or is this about something else entirely, like shifting the body into a different state of survival?
That is exactly the right question, Jane. We are not trying to play doctor or perform a miracle in the kitchen. Our goal is preservation. Think of it like a house on fire. While you wait for the fire department, you don't necessarily try to put out the whole blaze yourself, but you might close the doors to stop the oxygen from feeding the flames. In the case of a stroke, the fire is the lack of oxygen reaching the brain. When we panic, when we stand up, pace, or breathe rapidly and shallowly, we are actually increasing the body's demand for oxygen and sending stress hormones flooding through our system. This makes the heart work harder and can actually worsen the strain on the brain. What we want to do is the opposite. We want to put the body into a low consumption mode. We want to lower the metabolic demand of the brain so that the little bit of oxygen that is still trickling through can last longer. We are essentially buying time for the specialists at the hospital. If we can understand that the brain is in a fragile state of waiting, we realize that our primary job in those first 10 minutes is to be the brain's protector, keeping the environment as stable as possible until the experts arrive with the tools to clear the blockage. It is about quiet, deliberate action rather than frantic movement.
Dr. Gupta, one of the most heartbreaking things I hear from our audience is this deep-seated hesitation to speak up when something feels wrong because they are terrified of being a burden or making a scene over what might be nothing. There is this stoicism in the older generation, a tendency to wait and see if the numbness or the dizziness just fades away on its own, almost as if they are negotiating with fate to avoid a trip to the emergency room. Why is it that this specific age group is so prone to downplaying these life-threatening signals? And how does that psychological trap of silence become the biggest obstacle to survival when the brain is clearly sending out an SOS?
You have touched on the silent crisis of the polite patient, Jane, and I saw this vividly with a man named Mr. Robert Keller. Everyone called him Bob, a 68-year-old living in Tampa, Florida. Bob was in his garage working on a birdhouse when his left hand suddenly went weak and his speech became slightly slurred, almost like he had a marble in his mouth. But instead of calling for help, Bob just sat down on his workbench and waited. He told me later that he didn't want to ruin his wife's afternoon or have an ambulance wake up the neighbors, and because the symptoms actually started to fade after 15 minutes, he convinced himself it was just a pinched nerve or dehydration. This is the trap of ambiguity because a TIA or a mini stroke can feel temporary, but it is actually a massive warning shot that the brain's plumbing is failing. By the time the real stroke hit him hours later, he had lost precious time because he chose silence over making a fuss. And that is the tragedy I see far too often, where the desire to be independent and helpful actually leads to the very loss of independence they fear. We have to realize that at this stage of life, your body isn't just asking for a favor, it is issuing a command. And ignoring it out of politeness is like seeing smoke in the kitchen and deciding not to call the fire department because you don't want to bother them while they are eating.
It is so easy to empathize with Bob because nobody wants to be the center of a medical emergency, but that delay seems to be where the danger compounds. When you talk about the fast signs, face, arms, speech, and time, is it possible that a stroke actually affects the very part of the brain we need to make a rational decision, making it even harder for someone like Bob to realize he is in grave danger?
That is a brilliant and terrifying point, Jane, because a stroke is one of the few medical emergencies that can actually disable your ability to perceive that you are sick, a condition we sometimes call anosognosia. When the right side of the brain is affected, a person might not even realize their left arm isn't moving, or they might think their slurred speech sounds perfectly normal to their own ears. Bob told me he felt off, but his brain was busy making excuses for why he should just stay seated, and that is why we tell family members that if you see the face drooping or hear the speech changing, you cannot wait for the patient to agree that they need help. You have to take the lead because their internal compass is spinning. We need to replace that wait-and-see culture with an act-and-be-sure culture, because I would much rather have a patient come into the ER for a false alarm than have them stay home and lose their ability to walk or talk forever. The brain is a masterpiece of timing, and when we let those minutes slip away in the name of not being a burden, we are essentially throwing away the very tools we need to remain active and present in our families' lives.
So it really is a race against a clock that the patient might not even be able to see or hear ticking. If we are to bridge that gap between the first sign of trouble and the arrival of professional help, how do we begin to train ourselves to react instinctively, almost like a fire drill for the soul, so that we don't fall into that trap of hesitation?
It starts with accepting that your life is worth the bother of 1,000 false alarms, Jane. I often tell my patients that their children and grandchildren would much rather spend a few hours in a waiting room for a nothing event than spend years in a rehabilitation center wishing they had been called sooner. We have to pre-decide our response, meaning you tell yourself right now, if I feel my face go heavy, if my arm won't lift, or if I can't find a simple word, I'm calling 911 immediately, no questions asked, no waiting for it to pass. In Bob's case, he eventually made it to us, but the road back was so much steeper because of those hours of hesitation in the garage. We want to catch the brain while it is still whispering its distress, not wait until it is screaming in a full-blown crisis, because by then, the options for treatment like clot-busting drugs start to vanish. It is a shift in mindset from being a victim of a sudden event to being a proactive guardian of your own neurological future, even if it feels embarrassing in the moment.
Dr. Gupta, there is a pervasive myth among many seniors that a stroke is simply an inevitable part of aging, a stroke of bad luck or fate, that you either survive or you don't. This fatalism leads to a sense of helplessness, where people feel that if it's happening, there's nothing they can do in those first few minutes to change the outcome. From a neurosurgical perspective, how much of the brain's damage is actually set in stone the moment the blockage happens, and how much of it is a dynamic process that we can actually influence by how we treat our bodies while waiting for the ambulance?
This idea that the die is cast the moment a stroke starts is one of the most dangerous misconceptions in medicine, Jane. The truth is that the brain is incredibly resilient, but it is also incredibly hungry, and it doesn't just die all at once. It undergoes a progressive failure that we can absolutely slow down. When a blood vessel is blocked, the core area may be lost quickly, but there is a vast territory around it that is struggling to survive on fumes or collateral blood flow from neighboring vessels. Scientific research on the time is brain phenomenon has quantified that every second matters because the penumbra, that at-risk tissue, is essentially holding its breath. If we can keep the blood pressure stable, keep the head at the right angle, and keep the person from overexerting themselves, we are giving those hibernating cells a chance to stay alive until we can get into the cath lab and pull that clot out. I have seen patients who had a massive stroke, but because they were managed perfectly in the first 20 minutes, they walked out of the hospital 3 days later, whereas others with smaller strokes who panicked or waited too long ended up with permanent disabilities.
That is a powerful distinction, that we aren't just passive observers to our own medical crisis. When you talk about the golden window, many people think that only applies to the doctors in the hospital with the fancy machines. But it sounds like you're saying the window actually opens in the living room. If the difference between walking again and being paralyzed is measured in those first few minutes, how does the average person's understanding of fate need to change to become a tool for survival?
It has to change from fate to physiology, Jane. You have to realize that you are the first responder in your own life. When we look at the data, the speed of neuronal loss is staggering, roughly 32,000 neurons every second, but that rate is not fixed. It is influenced by the environment we provide for the brain. If you are upright, moving around and hyperventilating because you think this is the end, you are actually accelerating that death rate by demanding more energy from a brain that has no fuel. But if you understand the science, you realize that by reclining properly and breathing deeply, you are performing a form of neurological first aid. You are essentially telling your brain, I am going to help you wait for the cavalry. This isn't about fate, it's about managing a biological crisis with the same logic you would use to manage a leaking pipe in your house. You don't just stand there and watch it flood, you turn off the main valve. In this case, the valve is the metabolic demand you place on your system.
It's almost like you're describing a way to put the brain into battery saver mode while we wait for the power to be restored. Does this mean that even in the most severe cases where the symptoms are very dramatic, there is still a reason to hope and a reason to be incredibly disciplined about how we move and breathe in those moments?
Absolutely, Jane. Hope is actually a physiological tool because it keeps the sympathetic nervous system from going into a total tailspin. Even when a person is experiencing half-body paralysis, there is often a significant portion of the brain that is simply stunned and can be recovered if we maintain the right conditions. I have seen cases where the initial CT scan looked devastating, but because the patient was kept calm and well oxygenated through controlled breathing and proper positioning by a family member, the eventual recovery was nothing short of miraculous. We have to stop thinking of a stroke as a final sentence and start seeing it as a critical negotiation for time. Every action you take to lower your heart rate and keep your head steady is a vote for your future ability to hold your spouse's hand or drive a car. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation, and it requires a level of focus that goes beyond just waiting. It requires a deep understanding that your brain is still in the fight and it needs you to be its ally.
Dr. Gupta, panic is such a primal, overwhelming force, especially when you realize your body is no longer obeying you. We've talked about the right things to do, but I want to look at the wrong things, the instinctive reactions that feel helpful but are actually destructive. I imagine many people, out of pure fear, start moving around to test themselves or try to force their breathing. Can you walk us through a scenario where a person's natural reaction to a health scare actually becomes a second wave of attack on their own brain?
This is a critical point, Jane, because our survival instincts were designed for running away from predators, not for managing a blocked artery in the brain. I remember the case of Mrs. Linda Martinez, a 74-year-old from Phoenix, Arizona. Linda was in her garden when she noticed the left side of her face felt heavy, and her speech became slightly garbled. Her immediate reaction was one of pure terror, and she began to pace rapidly back and forth, trying to walk it off and screaming for her daughter. She then rushed inside to find her blood pressure cuff and her medications. Her heart was pounding at 120 beats per minute, and she was taking short, gasping breaths. By the time the ambulance arrived, Linda was in much worse shape than when the symptoms first started. Why? Because by running, pacing, and hyperventilating, she forced her heart to pump harder against a potential blockage and increased the brain's need for oxygen at the exact moment the supply was restricted. She was effectively starving her brain of the very resource it was already lacking. Panic causes a massive release of adrenaline, which spikes blood pressure, and while you might think higher pressure helps push blood through, it can actually cause further damage or even convert an ischemic stroke into a hemorrhagic one.
It's so tragic because Linda was just trying to save herself, but her body's fight or flight response was actually fueling the fire. When we see someone we love in that state, pacing, gasping, or trying to do too much, it's our instinct to help them move or to get them a glass of water. Is there a danger in these common helping behaviors? And how do we stop the second wave of damage that you mentioned?
The danger is very real, Jane. When someone is having a stroke, you should never give them anything to eat or drink because a stroke often impairs the swallowing reflex and they could easily aspirate and choke, adding a lung crisis to a brain crisis. Furthermore, trying to move them too much can be harmful. In Linda's case, her daughter tried to help her sit bolt upright and then walk to the car, but every time Linda moved, her brain had to work to coordinate that movement, using up precious energy. The best thing a bystander or the patient themselves can do is to stop all unnecessary movement immediately. You have to be the anchor in the storm. If you are the one experiencing it, you must tell yourself, I am having a medical event and any movement I make right now is an expensive luxury my brain cannot afford. It sounds cold, but you have to treat your body like a machine on its last bit of fuel. Linda's story is a reminder that being busy in a crisis is often less effective than being still. Stillness is not passivity, it is a strategic defense.
So the goal is to become as still and as calm as possible to lower the metabolic cost of staying alive. But for someone like Linda, who is terrified of dying, how do you actually convince the nervous system to settle down when everything in your mind is screaming danger?
It comes down to focusing on the one thing you can still control, your breath. When Linda was gasping, she was blowing off too much carbon dioxide, which can actually cause blood vessels in the brain to constrict, the last thing you want during a stroke. If she had been able to switch to slow nasal breathing, inhaling for a count of 4 and exhaling for a count of 6, she would have sent a signal to her vagus nerve to slow down the heart and lower the blood pressure. This isn't just relaxation, it's a physiological override. By breathing slowly, you are telling your heart that the predator has left, even if the clot is still there. This lowers the brain's demand for oxygen, allowing the small amount of blood getting through to do more work. We have to teach people that in the face of a stroke, doing nothing physically while doing everything to remain calm is the most heroic and effective action they can take. It's about saving your resources for the long fight ahead in the hospital.
Dr. Gupta, there's something you said earlier that really stayed with me, the idea that the brain is waiting for us to make a move. It's a haunting image, the thought of those millions of cells in a state of suspended animation, essentially hanging in the balance between life and death. Can you take us deeper into that waiting phase when you're in the operating room looking at the brain of someone who has just had a stroke? What do you see that confirms this window of opportunity exists, and why does it feel like a negotiation for time?
It is a profound experience, Jane, and it truly changed how I view life and death. I remember a case involving a patient who had been brought in very quickly after a major vessel occlusion. When we were able to visualize the brain's activity, you could see that the area around the clot wasn't dead. It was just dark, quiet, and struggling. It looked like a city during a blackout where the backup generators are trying to keep the hospitals running while the rest of the lights are out. That area is what we call the penumbra, and it can stay in that state for several hours if the conditions are right. This is where the patient's decisions in the living room come into play. If that patient, let's say someone like Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, an 89-year-old from Sacramento, California, whom I consulted on, chooses to stay calm and minimize her body's stress, she is effectively keeping those backup generators running longer. Evelyn had a significant stroke, but her daughter had heard me talk about this and immediately got her into a side-lying position and started coaching her to breathe slowly. When Evelyn arrived at the hospital, her blackout zone hadn't expanded nearly as much as we expected for someone of her age. Her brain was waiting for us, and because she hadn't exhausted her reserves through panic or movement, she gave us the time we needed to intervene.
It sounds like the brain has its own internal survival protocol, but it needs us to give it the permission to work by not getting in the way with our fear. When you talk about buying time for the ambulance, is there a specific physiological shift that happens when we choose to be still? Are we actually changing the chemistry of the brain in those moments?
Yes, absolutely. When you are in a state of high stress, your body releases cortisol and adrenaline, which increase glucose metabolism and acid production in the brain. In an area where blood flow is already low, that acid buildup can be toxic and kill cells faster. By staying calm, you are keeping the brain's environment more neutral. You are preventing that toxic cascade. It's like the difference between a car idling at a red light versus someone revving the engine while the brakes are on. The second one is going to blow the engine much faster. In the waiting phase, your brain is doing everything it can to redirect blood from other areas to the site of the injury. If you are busy using your muscles or processing a panic attack, you are diverting blood away from where it's needed most. Evelyn's decision, or rather her daughter's guidance to be still and breathe, was a medical intervention as real as any drug I could give. It allowed the penumbra to remain viable for an extra 30 or 40 minutes, which made all the difference when we finally got her into surgery.
It is so empowering to realize that even at 89, like Evelyn, the brain is still capable of that kind of resilience if we just support it correctly. It feels like we are giving the brain a shield against the damage. But many people might feel that without medical equipment, they are just sitting ducks. How do we convince them that their own body is the most sophisticated piece of equipment they have in that moment?
We have to remind them that medicine is just a way to assist the body's natural drive to heal. The most advanced clot retrieval tool in the world is useless if the brain tissue has already crossed the point of no return. The patient is the one who determines where that point is. By adopting the right posture and the right breath, you are managing your own internal life support system. I've seen it time and again. The patients who arrive at the ER with a sense of focused calm, even if they are terrified inside, always have better outcomes. They have preserved their brain capital. Evelyn is now back in her home, tending to her roses because she and her daughter knew that the brain doesn't just give up. It waits for a signal that help is on the way. That signal isn't a siren. It's the steady, rhythmic beat of a calm heart and the flow of a controlled breath. It's the ultimate partnership between the person and their most vital organ.
Dr. Gupta, we've talked about the dramatic moments of a stroke, but I think what scares many of our listeners is the whisper, those subtle, confusing signs that are so easy to brush off as just getting older or having a bad day. We've all had moments where we forget a word or feel a bit wobbly, but how do we distinguish between a normal lapse and the brain quietly signaling that a catastrophe is unfolding? Is there a danger in being too tough or too patient with these small symptoms?
That is the great deception of neurology, Jane. We often expect a stroke to be a thunderclap event, but for many it begins with a mumble. Take the case of Mr. James O'Connor, we call him Jim, an 82-year-old from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Jim was a retired steel worker, a tough guy who didn't like to complain. One morning, he felt a bit of transient confusion. He couldn't quite remember where he put his keys, and his vision in one eye got a little blurry, like there was a smudge on his glasses. He also felt a slight unsteadiness when he walked to the mailbox. Jim just thought, well, I'm 82, my blood sugar must be low, and he went to take a nap. That nap was almost his last. What Jim was experiencing were the whispers of a stroke, small disruptions in blood flow that were failing to provide enough oxygen to his cognitive and motor centers. The danger of being tough like Jim is that you are ignoring the brain's early warning system. By the time the whisper becomes a scream, total paralysis or loss of speech, you've already lost the most critical window for treatment. We have to learn that any sudden new neurological change, no matter how small, is a medical emergency until proven otherwise.
It's that word sudden that seems to be the key. For someone like Jim, who is used to minor aches and pains, it must be so hard to admit that a little bit of blurriness is worth a trip to the hospital. When the brain is under-oxygenated, does it actually lose the ability to judge its own condition? Does the whisper include a bit of denial as a symptom?
You've hit on a very sophisticated point, Jane. Yes, denial is often a direct symptom of the stroke itself. When the frontal or parietal lobes are affected, your insight center can be compromised. Jim wasn't just being stubborn, his brain was actually failing to register the severity of the situation. This is why the FAST acronym is so vital. It's an objective test. If you can't smile evenly, if one arm drifts down, if your speech sounds like word salad, it doesn't matter how you feel or what you think it is. The physical reality of those signs is the truth. Jim's blurriness and his long choang, his unsteadiness, were signs that his cerebellum and visual cortex were already under attack. I tell my patients, if you wouldn't ignore a fire alarm just because the smoke didn't smell that bad yet, don't ignore your brain's whispers. The brain doesn't have pain receptors, so it can't tell you it hurts like a broken leg can. It can only tell you it's not working right. And that not working right is your signal to move.
So for the person who is home alone, like Jim was, the mission is to recognize that one small sign is enough. If they find themselves in that state of whispering symptoms and they are starting to feel that confusion or that off feeling, what is the one thing they must keep in their mind to overcome that fog of denial and take action?
They have to remember that better safe than sorry is a literal life-saving strategy. I want everyone to have a mental tripwire if you experience any of the fast signs. Even if they only last for 60 seconds and then go away, you call 911. Jim was lucky because his daughter stopped by and noticed he was acting different, but if he had been alone, he might not have woken up from that nap. The whisper is actually a gift. It's the brain giving you a head start. If you act during the whisper phase, the chances of a full recovery are exponentially higher because we can often prevent the scream from ever happening. We need to respect our brains enough to listen to them when they talk softly. Jim eventually got the care he needed, but he had to learn the hard way that at 82, toughing it out is the most dangerous thing you can do. Your brain is your most precious asset. Treat every little glitch like the 5-alarm fire it potentially is.
Dr. Gupta, we live in an age where everyone wants to be their own doctor, especially with the internet at our fingertips. When a crisis hits, our first instinct is often to reach for the medicine cabinet, to take an aspirin because we've heard it helps with hearts, or to take a blood pressure pill because we think my pressure must be too high, or we tell a loved one to walk it off or lay down flat and rest. These seem like common sense, helpful actions, but in the context of a stroke, can these remedies actually be the very things that push a patient over the edge?
This is where good intentions can have devastating consequences, Jane. One of the most common and dangerous mistakes is taking aspirin or a blood pressure medication during a suspected stroke. While aspirin is great for some heart attacks, if the stroke is hemorrhagic, meaning a blood vessel has burst rather than being blocked, giving an aspirin will make the bleeding much worse and can be fatal. You can't tell the difference between a blockage and a bleed without a CT scan, so the rule is nothing by mouth. No pills, no water, nothing. Similarly, if you take a pill to rapidly lower your blood pressure, you might actually be starving the brain of the very pressure it needs to push blood past a blockage. The brain often naturally raises blood pressure during a stroke to try and force oxygen to the struggling areas. If we artificially drop that pressure in the kitchen, we might inadvertently kill off the penumbra. We have to resist the urge to fix the numbers and instead focus on supporting the person until they reach the specialist.
It's a frightening thought that the medicine in our cabinet could become a poison in that moment. And what about the physical position of the body? I think most of us, if we felt faint or sick, would naturally want to lie flat on our backs or perhaps sit up straight to breathe better. You've mentioned that lying flat isn't always the best answer. Why is the standard rest position potentially harmful for a stroke patient, and what is the risk of walking it off?
Walking it off is perhaps the worst thing you can do because it increases the metabolic demand of the entire body and diverts blood flow to the leg muscles when every drop is needed in the cranium. As for lying flat on your back, the supine position, it can be problematic for two reasons. First, if the patient vomits, which is common during a stroke, they can easily aspirate and choke. Second, for some types of strokes, lying completely flat can increase intracranial pressure, which puts more stress on the injured brain tissue. On the flip side, sitting bolt upright can sometimes make it harder for blood to reach the brain against gravity if the blood pressure is low. This is why we advocate for a very specific middle ground, side-lying with the head slightly elevated. It protects the airway and balances the need for blood flow with the need to keep pressure stable. We have to unlearn these folk remedy instincts and replace them with precise evidence-based actions. The goal isn't comfort, it's clinical stability.
So, the message is clear. Don't play doctor and don't rely on what grandma used to do. If we find ourselves in that high-pressure situation and we're tempted to give our spouse an aspirin or help them walk to the couch, how do we keep our cool and stick to the less is more approach? How do we convince ourselves that doing less is actually doing more for their survival?
You have to view yourself as a bridge to the hospital, Jane. Your job is to keep the cargo, the brain, intact until it reaches the destination. Every time you reach for a pill or try to make them walk, you are taking a risk with a bridge that is already swaying. I tell people to think of it this way. The paramedics are coming with the right tools, the right drugs, and the right knowledge. Your only job is to make sure the patient is in the best possible condition when they arrive. That means call 911, keep them still, monitor their breathing, and stay by their side. It takes immense discipline to watch someone you love suffer and not do something active, but in this case, your restraint is your greatest gift to them. By not giving that aspirin, you might be saving them from a catastrophic brain bleed. By not making them walk, you are saving millions of neurons. It's a different kind of heroism, the heroism of calm, informed observation.
Dr. Gupta, we've reached the part of the conversation that I know everyone has been waiting for. We've talked about the whys and the don'ts, but now I want to get very practical. Let's talk about that specific bridge you mentioned. If someone is with a loved one, or even if they are alone and they've called 911, what are the exact physical steps they should take? You've mentioned a side-lying position and a specific way of breathing. Can you walk us through this brain protection protocol as if you were right there in the room with us, helping us buy those extra minutes for the brain?
I want everyone to listen closely because this is the script you need to have in your head. I saw this save a life with Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, that 89-year-old from Sacramento I mentioned earlier. When she felt her side go weak, her daughter immediately took charge. Step 1, call 911. This is non-negotiable and must happen first. Step 2, get the person into a recovery position or side-lying position. You want them on their side, preferably their strong side if one side is paralyzed. Use a pillow or a folded blanket to prop their head up slightly, about 30 degrees, not too high and not flat. This position does two vital things. It keeps the airway clear in case they vomit, and it helps manage the pressure in the brain. Step 3, minimize all movement. Do not let them try to stand up or get comfortable on a different chair. Keep them right there. This is about neurological stillness.
It sounds so simple, yet I can see how it would be difficult to maintain in the middle of a crisis. And then there is the breath you mentioned earlier, that how we breathe can actually change the brain's chemistry. For someone like Evelyn, who was probably terrified and breathing very fast, how did her daughter help her use her breath as a shield? What is the rhythm of survival we should be aiming for?
The breath is the only part of the autonomic nervous system we can consciously control, Jane. When you are having a stroke, your body goes into overdrive, which uses up massive amounts of oxygen. To protect the brain, we need to switch from panic breathing to protective breathing. I call it the 4-7-8, or just slow nasal breathing. You want to inhale slowly through the nose for a count of 4, hold for just a second, and then exhale through the mouth for a count of 6 or 7. The key is to make the exhale longer than the inhale. This stimulates the vagus nerve, which tells the heart to slow down and the blood vessels to stop constricting from stress. In Evelyn's case, her daughter sat right in front of her, held her hand, and said, "Mom, look at me. Breathe with me." And they did it together. By slowing Evelyn's heart rate, they reduced the brain's metabolic demand, essentially buying her more time before the cells in the penumbra began to fail. It is a way of cooling down the system from the inside out.
Breathe with me. That is such a powerful human moment in the middle of a medical emergency. It's as if The daughter was sharing her own calm with her mother. For our listeners who might be alone when this happens, can they do this for themselves? Can they find that side-lying position and coach their own breath even while they are waiting for the door to open for the paramedics?
Yes, they can, and they must. If you are alone after you call 911 and unlock your front door so the paramedics can get in, find a spot on the floor or a low sofa, get on your side. Do not try to stay upright in a chair where you might fall. Once you are on your side, close your eyes if you have to, and focus entirely on that long, slow exhale. Every long breath out is a message to your brain. We are okay, we are waiting, we are saving energy. It keeps you from spiraling into a panic that would only worsen the stroke. Evelyn told me later that focusing on the breath was the only thing that kept her from giving up to the fear. It gave her a job to do. That is the secret, Jane, giving the person a role in their own survival. You aren't just a victim waiting for help. You are a participant in the preservation of your own mind. It's a small thoiquen, a small habit, but it can be the difference between a recovery and a tragedy.
Dr. Gupta, we've covered so much ground today, from the biology of the brain to the psychology of the patient. As we begin to wrap up, I want to leave our audience with something they can carry with them every day. We've talked about the whispers and the fast signs, but there's this lingering issue of trusting your gut versus trusting the symptoms. In your experience, why is it so vital for seniors to prioritize what they see over what they feel? And how can they build the reflex of action before the panic sets in?
This is the golden rule of aging, Jane. Don't trust your feelings, trust the facts. Our feelings are often tempered by a lifetime of resilience and a desire to not cause trouble. We might feel fine enough or think it's probably just the weather. But the fast signs, face drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulty, are facts. They are objective evidence that the brain is struggling. I tell my patients to treat their health like a pilot treats a cockpit. If a warning light flashes on the dashboard, a pilot doesn't say, "Well, I feel like the engine is fine, so I'll ignore it." They follow the protocol. We need to have that same pilot's mindset for our bodies. The reflex we need to build is the fast 911 position breath sequence. It should be as automatic as reaching for your seatbelt when you get in a car. You don't wait for a crash to put your seatbelt on. You do it as a standard precaution. If we can get people to practice this, just mentally rehearsing it once a month, it stays in the muscle memory of the brain, ready to be used when the fog of a stroke tries to roll in.
I love that analogy of the pilot. It takes the emotion out of it and makes it about safety and protocol. But there's still that fear of the hospital, isn't there? The fear of the tests, the needles, and the loss of control. How do you comfort someone who is more afraid of the process of being a patient than they are of the stroke itself? How do we help them see the hospital not as a place of loss, but as the place where their future is being handed back to them?
We have to reframe the hospital as the restoration center. When you get to us, especially if you get there quickly, we have incredible tools, thrombectomy procedures that can pull a clot out and restore blood flow in minutes, drugs that can dissolve blockages like magic. But these tools only work if you get to the door. I've had many older patients tell me I was afraid if I went in, I'd never come out. And I tell them, if you stay home, that fear is much more likely to come true. If you come to us, we are your partners in getting you back to your garden, back to your grandkids, back to your life. We aren't there to take your independence. We are there to save it. The data is clear. The faster you act on the signs, the less hospital time you actually need. Early intervention leads to shorter stays and better outcomes. So trusting the signs isn't just about survival, it's about getting back to normal as fast as possible.
It's about protecting the life you love. Dr. Gupta, if there is one message you want a 70-year-old listening to this in their living room right now to remember, one thing that should be etched into their mind, what would it be? If they remember nothing else from this hour, what is the golden thread that will keep them safe?
The golden thread is simply this: your brain is worth the call every single time. Don't negotiate, don't wait for the symptoms to pass, and don't worry about being a burden. You are a miracle of biology, and your brain has a remarkable capacity to survive if you just give it those first few minutes of calm and the right medical attention. Remember, time is brain. But also remember that you are the guardian of that time. By recognizing the signs and reacting with the protocol we've discussed, you are taking a stand for your future. You are telling your brain, I've got you, and you are giving us doctors the chance to do our best work. It is a partnership of trust, trusting the science, trusting the symptoms, and ultimately trusting that your life is worth fighting for in every single second.
We have come to the end of a truly profound conversation. It's strange, isn't it? We started talking about one of the most frightening medical events a person can face, yet I find myself feeling a sense of peace and empowerment. It's the realization that while aging brings challenges, it also brings a depth of wisdom, a body wisdom, that can be our greatest ally. Dr. Gupta, as we close this episode of Healthy Kidneys After 60, you've given us so much more than medical advice. You've given us a kitchban, a script for courage. I want to leave the final words to you. If you could speak directly to the hearts of our listeners, what is the most important thing they should hold on to as they move forward into their golden years?
Thank you, Jane. This has been a conversation I will carry with me as well. My final thought for everyone listening is this. Your body has spent 6, 7, 8 decades learning how to survive. It is an expert at living. When a crisis like a stroke happens, your body isn't failing you. It is just facing a challenge it can't solve alone. It needs your help. It needs your mind to stay calm while its circuits are struggling. If I could leave you with 3 golden rules to live by, they would be these. First, never ignore a whisper from your brain. If you see a fast sign, call 911 immediately, because waiting is the only thing that is truly too late. Second, in those minutes while help is on the way, give your brain the gift of stillness. Use that side-lying position and that slow, deep breath to lower the demand on your system. It is the most effective medicine you can provide in your own home. And third, practice this knowledge when you are well. Rehearse it in your mind so that it becomes a reflex of love for yourself, not a reaction of fear. You have so much life left to live, so many stories still to tell, and by being informed, you are making sure those stories continue. It has been an honor to share this space with you, Jane, and with everyone listening at home. Your health is your most precious inheritance. Guard it with calm and with courage.
A reflex of love for yourself. What a beautiful way to think about it. Dr. Sanjay Gupta, thank you for your expertise, your stories, and most of all, your heart. You've reminded us that even in the face of a stroke, we are not helpless. We are the protectors of our own minds. To our listeners, thank you for joining us today on Healthy Kidneys After 60. We hope this episode has given you the tools and the confidence to navigate the years ahead with strength and clarity. If you found this conversation helpful, please consider subscribing to our podcast and sharing this episode with your friends and family. It truly could be the thing that saves a life. Join us next time as we continue to explore the ways you can live your most vibrant, healthy life after 60. Until then, take a deep breath, stay still when you need to, and remember, you are worth every second. I'm Jane Pauley, and from all of us here, stay well and take care of one another. Good night.
Good night, Jane. It was truly a pleasure. To everyone listening, stay safe, be proactive, and remember that your brain is always fighting for you, so keep fighting for it. Thank you for having me.